Have you ever wondered what it takes to audit a company that literally builds our world versus one that takes directly from it? Well, today, we're going to peek behind the financial curtain of two industrial giants, and we're going to see how the simple act of auditing reveals two totally different ways of doing business.
So just look at this. On one side, you've got the clean, structured, almost predictable world of manufacturing. And on the other, you see the raw, rugged, unpredictable world of extractive industries. Yeah, they're both about production, but how auditors figure out what they're actually worth, worlds apart. And that difference, it has some huge implications.
Okay, let's dive right in. We're setting up a bit of a head-to-head here. We're calling them the makers versus the takers. We're going to explore the really unique challenges auditors face when they're looking at companies that create things from scratch versus those that pull resources right out of the ground. Trust me, what they find is pretty surprising.
So here it is, the fundamental difference. Our makers, think of a company like San Miguel Corporation, they take raw materials and they transform them into something totally new. But our takers, like Philex Mining, they get those raw materials by pulling them straight from nature. Now that sounds super simple, right? But believe me, that one little distinction changes absolutely everything from an auditor's point of view.
So, let's start with the first huge challenge for any auditor. How in the world do you put a price tag on all the giant, physical stuff a company owns? We're talking about things you can literally go out and touch, but figuring out their value, well, that is anything but straightforward.
In the accounting world, this stuff is called property, plant, and equipment, or PPE for short. The easiest way to think about it is as the physical backbone of these companies. You know, the massive factories, the complicated machinery, those giant earth movers, all of it. These aren't just assets on a spreadsheet. They are the engines that make the whole operation go.
And just take a look at this. This is a real snippet from San Miguel's financial statement. See that highlighted line for property, plant, and equipment? The scale of what we're talking about is just wow. That number itself is absolutely massive, and it tells a really interesting story.
That's over 128 billion pesos. Just let that sink in for a second. This one single number represents the value of all of their physical stuff. It's one of the biggest numbers on their entire balance sheet, and it's an auditor's job to prove that it's real.
And that brings us to the big multi-billion peso question, right? If you're an auditor, how do you even begin to confirm that a number with that many zeros isn't just a wild guess, but is actually accurate and fair? It's a monumental task.
Okay, so a big part of the answer is understanding how these things lose value. For a manufacturer, it's pretty simple. A machine gets old, it gets worn out. We call that depreciation. But for a mine, it's different. Every single ton of ore you pull out of the ground means there's one less ton left forever. The resource is literally being used up, and that has a different name, depletion. Two totally different concepts for two totally different worlds.
Okay, so we've talked about the value of the big stuff. Now let's switch gears and look at the cost of actually using all that stuff to create products. This is where we really get into the nitty-gritty of a company's daily operations. And this is where you can really see how different these two worlds are. For a maker like San Miguel, costs start with things you can see and touch, like materials and labor. But for a taker, like Philex Mining, the costs begin way, way earlier. They have to spend a fortune just to find the resources in the first place, and then even more to develop the site before they can pull a single ounce of anything out of the ground. It's a completely different cost structure right from day one.
So how do you track costs when you're making literally millions of identical things? Well, accountants have a pretty clever method called process costing. Instead of trying to track every single little item, you just don't. You add up all your costs, divide by the total number of things you made, and voila, you get a single, reliable cost for each unit, whether that's a bottle of beer or a ton of ore.
And why does this matter so much? Well, for San Miguel, it's about knowing the true cost of every single product they put on the shelf. For Philex, it's about assigning a real, defensible cost to every ton of rock they pull from the earth. Because if they get this number wrong, their entire financial picture, their profits, their value, the whole shebang is basically a house of cards.
And that leads us perfectly into the next big headache for auditors, inventory. This is all the stuff a company has made but hasn't sold yet. It's just sitting there in a warehouse or in a big stockpile, and its value is a constantly moving target. It's a real challenge. And just like with their big equipment, the numbers here are just staggering. For San Miguel alone, we're talking about more than 47 billion pesos worth of inventory. That is a massive amount of cash tied up in products just waiting. And for an auditor, that presents a huge verification problem.
So this creates a really fascinating puzzle.
The price of raw materials goes up and down all the time. So, if you've got a warehouse full of stuff you bought at all different prices, how do you possibly decide what it's all worth today?
Well, one very popular way is called FIFO, which stands for first in, first out. You just assume you sell your oldest stuff first. So in this example, since prices are rising, it means the cost of the stuff you sold is lower, and the value of the inventory you have left is based on those newer, more expensive prices.
But now, watch this. What happens if we use a different method, like weighted average? Here, we just blend all the costs together to get an average. Using the exact same sales numbers, the entire financial picture flips. Suddenly, the cost of goods sold is higher and the ending inventory is worth less. This is so important. A simple accounting choice can totally change how profitable a company looks on paper, and an auditor has to make sure that choice makes sense.
All right, finally, let's talk about what might just be the most important job for an auditor in the 21st century. Because it's not just about the money anymore, it's also about a company's real, tangible impact on the planet.
You see, the role of the auditor has fundamentally changed. They become a watchdog, really. Their job now is to sniff out hidden environmental costs and to make sure that a company's green promises are more than just slick marketing.
For our two companies, this looks completely different. For San Miguel, an auditor might dig into their spending on social responsibility, their packaging waste, or their energy use. But for Philex Mining, the focus is razor sharp. Are they actually putting enough money aside to fix the land when the mine closes? Are they following all the strict environmental laws to the letter?
And this is where we run into the very real danger of greenwashing. Auditors have to basically become detectives. Is that so-called environmental budget really just a marketing campaign in disguise? Have they conveniently underestimated how much it's going to cost to clean up their mess years from now? An auditor's job here is to protect not just the investors, but all of us from being fooled by a pretty green logo.
And all of this leaves us with one final and, I think, really crucial question. In a world where a company's green image can be one of its most valuable assets, is an auditor's stamp of approval really enough for you to trust what they're saying? That's a question we all need to be asking. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.